So I'm John Donatich, director of Yale University Press, and really pleased to welcome Ned Blackhawk to this talk to celebrate and introduce his new book, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History. And I could start right there, Ned. I mean, these are really interesting words, rediscovery and unmaking in this title and subtitle. Mm-hmm. It's almost as if you have to take something apart to see it right. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your choice of these two words and why you made that choice.
Well, thank you for identifying what are two of the central initial claims or kind of imperatives that the book is trying to do. Is simultaneously trying to say two things. One is that American history has recently been rediscovered by a generation of Native American historians, myself included, and I'm deeply indebted to this generation for establishing a lot of the findings that have fundamentally unmade or remade kind of conventional paradigms of American historical analysis. Mm-hmm. I think we need to keep going and kind of further this scholarly momentum. And so I'm hopeful that we can continue to remake or perhaps unmake some of the unhelpful kind of categories of analysis that have often elided or marginalized this subject from broader understandings of America.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting time to be an historian right now. It seems like every week historians are asserting a new kind of relevance and yet getting sometimes in trouble right. for asserting a certain kind of relevance. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you see the challenges of being a historian today, the opposing tensions of presentism and originalism, and mm-hmm. And how easy it is to say the wrong thing sometimes. How do you approach that?
Well, it's funny because in my field of Native American history, there's often an ambiguity in many readers or audience members' understandings around even the term or nomenclature. And in the last generation or so, American Indian has kind of faded from a kind of popular common use, at least in a kind of public discourse, and replaced by a more recent categories such as Native American and or Indigenous American. I'm actually a product of a generation that is very comfortable with the term American Indian history or American Indian studies. And so I'm mindful of other people's potential concerns around these subjects, but kind of rely upon what seems to me the clearest kind of forms of inquiry around the subject. But you're right, it is kind of a complex moment we're in, with seemingly new either developments or debates or reconfigurations occurring pretty readily in American historical kind of practice and study. A series of prominent monuments have come down. Public, in my field, athletic programs such as or sports franchises such as the Washington Redskins or Cleveland Indians have changed their names and mascots. So it's really a kind of a moment of kind of new consciousness in certain ways in America more broadly. And it's not surprising that there's some resistance or reluctance or misunderstanding about the kind of origins of these kind of initiatives. But generally speaking, and this book is really kind of concerned about this, we're entering into a 21st century world more fully that is much more kind of diverse and multicultural in ways that many may not be familiar with. And so part of the introduction and other parts of this book really try to challenge a kind of binary black-white racial paradigm for us understanding American history, which is kind of at the heart of some of the recent movements for public activism and consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And have you seen a change in your students in approaching all this material?
A little bit. I've been doing this for a few years now and sometimes find student interests kind of growing at certain times in connection with larger changes in society. I've been working also with my colleagues on campus here to try to expand our Native American student population. And I see within that constituency in particular kind of hunger or kind of a real thirst for alternative understandings of American history than those that they received.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. We published just last fall a book by Joy Harjo, part of the Why I Write lecture series that she gave at Wyndham Campbell. And it was all on video, on Zoom, her presentation. And there was a wonderful introduction by the students here at Yale. And it was a warm welcome in native languages, and it was just a very celebratory moment, and so rich in the kind of love they had for this work. And I was very, very moved by that.
Yeah, I'd encourage anyone who hasn't perhaps learned about or seen that introduction to kind of find it. I think it's on the internet. And I think all of the students who were involved in that, and they, even during the pandemic, kind of found time and space to prepare a really beautiful introduction to Joy's both collection and her larger speech that I think she gave as part of that festival here.
That's right, yeah. And we actually published an expanded version of that as a book.
Well, that's what, and as you know, this book is also part of a series on Native American studies that the press has been doing now for 10 years. Mm-hmm. So we're celebrating a 10-year anniversary here with not just this series, but this larger Native American Cultural Center that opened in 2013. Mm-hmm.
So the Henry Rowe Cloud series.
Correct, yeah. And Henry Rowe Cloud and his partner Elizabeth Bender Cloud figure pretty prominently in chapter 11 and to a lesser extent 12 in this study. Mm-hmm. And as we talk about the book structure and content, we'll have opportunity to see how a really kind of incredible generation of Native American activists emerged in the early 20th century and kind of challenged the ideological and intellectual currents of their time.
Mm-hmm. And not just intellectual and scholarly, but political and constitutional. I mean, this is a really wonderful, sweeping history, and it's the kind of history that I personally love the best and love to publish the best, and it's our sweet spot at the press to have something driven by an argument, but you have to learn the context and the history from pre-colonial days to today to understand the argument. So the book has a double pleasure. One is to follow a rigorous argument, and then two, to actually recontextualize these centuries of American history within that argument. So it's a double pleasure to read it.
I appreciate, obviously, that observation. And it was the kind of intent to try to do a single volume overview of Native American history that wasn't exclusively focused on particular episodes or centuries or regions. Some reviewers or colleagues are calling it a continental history, mm-hmm. which it really, it wasn't really its intent, but it kind of has become its form. Mm-hmm. And as you know, the book is divided into two halves, part one and part two. One of which is basically to the U.S. Constitution. The other half is since the U.S. Constitution. And so that's a kind of natural kind of starting point or breaking point for certain kind of periodizations of American, particularly legal history since 1787, since the Constitution. But you can't really understand the subsequent history of the United States outside of its colonial or pre-national developments. And so the first half really expands upon this generation of scholarship, or synthesizes parts of it to really focus an argument around the kind of centrality of indigenous or Native Americans to the course of not just the Revolution, but the Constitution, the early Republic, the antebellum era, throughout the Civil War era, into the 20th century. So it's been a lot of fun in certain ways, because I've had to kind of engage really canonical subjects of American historical inquiry, but to do so in a new way. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. And can you tell me a little bit about how you approached that constitutional history and continental history through? You basically say you can't understand any of this without having a Native American context. Can you talk a little bit about how that illuminated your understanding of the Constitution before and after?
Sure. We're about to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in how many summers from now? In 2026 mm-hmm. in July. And to say Native Americans have been marginalized or excised or put on the periphery of American revolutionary studies is that's even an overstatement. I mean, the extent of marginalization that has occurred around these subjects is really just shocking. And so there's a kind of simultaneous kind of recognition that Native Americans were so central to this period of American history, and they've subsequently been so thoroughly erased from that history in a way that is really, I think, disturbing or not just disappointing, but perhaps even like more kind of psychologically uncomfortable than many would perhaps be willing to recognize. Because if you look at the actual text from this period, the Declaration refers to Native Americans as merciless Indian savages. The Constitution, obviously, many years thereafter, codifies kind of certain kind of legal and kind of philosophical and political ideas into certain kind of enumerated powers that the federal government will have over Indian affairs. The treaty clause becomes the supreme law of the land, and all of the first treaties entered into by the Articles and subsequently, other than the Treaty of Paris, which recognizes American independence, and then the first treaties of the independent Articles and then Constitution are all with Indian nations. Mm-hmm. So the reality of this centrality is there in the documents. Mm-hmm. And one of the kind of exciting things, back to your kind of particular question about the Constitution, is that if you understand how those words ended up in those documents, you understand this history in a new fundamental way. And there's been just a small but growing literature on the kind of backcountry conflicts between Native Americans and British settlers in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, which ends at the Treaty of Paris in 1763. England inherits the new France Empire, or France's New World Empire, at least in North America, and essentially doubles its territorial size. And the stroke of a pen, as my colleague at Dartmouth, Colin Calloway, has termed it. And so immediately after 1763, the British settlers, particularly in the backcountry regions of places like New York State or Colony, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, anticipate a greater territorial opportunity now that France, their historic enemy, their Catholic antagonists, are gone essentially from the continent. But the French have been defeated, but their Indian allies haven't. And so there's a subsequent war called Pontiac's War in 1763 that erupts right in the aftermath of the British victory that deeply destabilizes interior relations. And so the British show up and try to initially subjugate militarily these insurgent Native activists or soldiers, but they're unable to. And so they start diplomatic, economic, and various types of social initiatives to incorporate them into a structure of imperial relations that deeply upsets their British subjects. And so their subjects start complaining that the elites in the seaports, the crown itself, the soldiers, are all doing things against their own interests. Mm-hmm. And they start marauding British trading caravans, heading to give Pontiac and his allies diplomatic goods to cement the kind of processes of peace that they anticipate. They begin passing out leaflets to one another to rise up against this seemingly despotic monarchical practice, and they even begin shooting and interdicting British forces themselves in and around a place called what becomes Fort Pitt in Pittsburgh in the backcountry of western Pennsylvania. That discourse starts using the term frontier for the first time. Mm. And they obviously have a deep-seated hostility towards Indian peoples from their previous war with the French during the 7 Years' War. And so those communities have a deep imprint, particularly upon Pennsylvania's kind of colonial politics for the next decade. They begin massacring and kind of marauding indigenous villages. And so there's a kind of percolating, not just discourse and set of violent relations, but there's an ideology there. And so that ideology eventually helps form what another colleague has called a common cause across the colonial world. And so while the vast preponderance of the scholarly literature on the Revolution has focused on kind of seaport elites in Philadelphia, Boston, to a lesser extent New York, and also Virginia, the gentry leaders, has focused on their ideas and their kind of space within a kind of Atlantic world. It's these interior communities who may have had perhaps most radical vision of a new anticipated political future. And so that compromise, which is not well known, is really a percolating and kind of motivating force in the kind of origins of the revolution, and then animates the subsequent structure of American diplomatic and kind of military practice thereafter, and troubles people like Washington when he's in office, because he knows that these interior regions are lawless, and he has himself property. One of his first acts as a civilian after he retires as commanding general of the Continental Army in December of 1783 is he goes back to his home, realizes his fortunes are in disarray, having essentially had an untended plantation for many years during the war, and essentially tries to inspect and kind of establish prosperous rents on his interior land possessions that he's gained over the last few decades in service for initially the Crown and now as a commanding general of the U.S. Continental Forces. So he's very aware of these interior spaces, and he's very concerned that all these interior peoples will not follow any form of governing practice. And he says things like, if they leave our boundaries and move into Indian territories, they should become subject to their laws. Mm-hmm. That they are no longer fit for our kind of jurisdiction. And so he has a vision of treaty making, of jurisdictional boundaries, of kind of political bilateral agreements of various kinds with native peoples that would surprise many to hear, but also it's a recognition that he and other founders have of the need for a kind of stronger federalist authority to regulate and govern these interior spaces. So it's no coincidence then, when the Constitution is written in summer of 1787, that the federal government becomes the arbiter of Indian affairs. It's in the Commerce Clause, that the federal government will adjudicate foreign relations with commerce between the states and with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes, as the 5 words are known. And so that power, which is lodged in the Constitution, which all the colonies turned states delegate to the federal government, becomes the basis for what we call now federal Indian law and policy. Mm-hmm. So you can't really understand this foundational moment in 1787 without this backcountry history or the backstory history that we just sketched, nor can you understand the subsequent evolution of the federal government's authority over Native Americans without kind of understanding a certain form of originalism. Right. And so it's a really kind of, I think, wonderfully rich history. Yep. But the sad part for a lot of us is that it's been so disregarded that one can take a U.S. history class or a constitutional law class or American legal history class and never know these things. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've been in some public or published debates with some of my colleagues who've written recent surveys of American history that have not focused on these subjects. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of These Truths by Jill Lepore. Right? Yeah. So Lepore has a kind of 20th century vision of American history, I would say, and I'm trying to advance, as many others are, a more 21st century vision.
Right. You know, that's a wonderful description of the first half of the book, and I remember being really struck by this sense of leaders moving through this history with some certain kind of strategic goal in mind, and yet at the same time having to deal with the kind of exigencies of daily life and political pushback. And so you're telling us a history kind of foot forward. It's pushing itself along, populated by these great characters, that people you just described. And it was at the end of the book, in the 20th century, when European colonialists, Hitler among them, were pointing to the American treatment of Indians to almost justify what they were doing in Africa and in interior Germany, in fact. Mm-hmm. And it was an incredible sort of moment of reckoning that we may be able to tell ourselves lies, but other people see what was going on and are using it for nefarious purposes.
There is a brief, but as you identify, potentially revelatory section in this last chapter of the book, which is essentially the history of Native Americans within the Cold War of America. But it starts with the Second World War, in which American Indians served in higher percentages than other American citizens, and in which American Indian policy got heavily redefined from its New Deal kind of Roosevelt administrative kind of priorities to a post-war, more assimilative, driven Cold War philosophy of known as termination. But in the middle of that kind of
frightening word,
right? It is, and it was accompanied by another urbanization program called relocation. And both of these policies were passed by the federal government in the early 1950s as an attempt to disaggregate federal commitments to, or disaggregate Indian lands and thereby erode federal treaty commitments to Native Americans, and to encourage the assimilation and/or Americanization of American Indians. And it was a really dire kind of political period that fostered a lot of activism that is kind of chronicled therein. But to try to get to that point of Native Americans in the Cold War U.S., I try to kind of summarize and bring together some findings about the war itself. And I have a few colleagues here on campus, including my colleague Tim Snyder, who've written a great deal about, obviously, in his field, the Holocaust and German expansion into Eastern Europe, in this wonderful book called Black Earth that you may know. And in Black Earth, Tim talks at some length about Hitler's ideology and where he was kind of drawing inspiration from. And it's in Mein Kampf, and it's in a whole range of speeches, his kind of fascination with America's ability to conquer interior continent and turn it into living space or free, open territories, essentially. And he says things that like the Volga should be our Mississippi. Right. And so it's like a chilling recognition. And then another colleague here on campus, a legal historian, I think it's John Whitman, wrote a book called Hitler's Racial Model or Minority Model or something, where he analyzes Nazi legal delegations that came to the United States to look at the codification of racial laws in the United States, not just involving African American segregation, but also American Indians. And so there's two kind of existing studies, among a few others, that have made these similar claims. And the book as a whole is trying to draw a lot of these studies together into a kind of new kind of portrait. So it's there. I also am in that section. I'm looking at Japanese settler colonialism in Asia. Just very briefly to kind of highlight that the ideology and manifest destiny that so dominated American kind of policy throughout the 19th century inspired subsequent forms of what scholars now call settler colonialism and other imperial projects.
As you're talking about, there's this, frightening dream of a homogenous nation building, and yet your book is awe-inspiring in the way that you capture so many different cultures, languages, peoples. What was it like to research that kind of incredible diversity?
I'm still kind of coming to terms with what the book does and doesn't do. And so I am kind of mindful that I was unable to do certain things that I may have initially tried to, or cover certain geographies, spaces, as well as I would have liked. But I did essentially try to create this single volume synthetic interpretive overview to potentially not just remedy existing inaccurate or kind of limited portraits of U.S. history, but potentially reach people who might carry these things forward. And so it does have a kind of attempt to highlight the heterogeneity and diversity of Native America, to basically say that there are these numerous distinct histories, but there are all these linkages that create a kind of unified Native American kind of historical experience, if we want to call it that. Mm-hmm. There are colonial themes of commonality, there are 19th century themes, and then there are more 20th century themes. And this 20th century theme of fighting the federal government and experiencing urbanization, often heavily either subsidized or institutionalized by the federal government, this growing form of activism, both in a regional and kind of national scale, and more recently, this kind of growing form of sovereign self-determination that becomes the nation's policy in the 70s. Those are kind of universal subjects within Native American history that bring together a real diversity of communities in ways that would be kind of hard for some to perhaps easily recognize, because there's very little tying peoples from the Native peoples from the Olympic Peninsula and Seminole Indians from southeastern Florida. The very, very different geographies, very different histories, very different kind of cultures, and obviously languages and other kind of distinctive. But there is a commonality. And so the commonality are essentially is history and kind of policy and law, activism, philosophies of shared commitments. And there's this kind of growing ideology of red power, as it's known in the late 60s and early 70s, that becomes a kind of unifying intellectual project, essentially, not just for Native peoples in the United States, but also in Canada and other parts of the particularly Anglophone Commonwealth world. And it's no coincidence that this paradigm of kind of global Southern colonial studies, as it's now known, originates from these kind of Commonwealth, Native studies, Indigenous studies kind of connections.
It's such an enriching understanding and illumination of American history. You know, it's such an eye opener, and also quite moving. I couldn't even think of the word that it's not agency, it's not resilience. It's just a lastingness. You know, of Indian peoples throughout these centuries of very purposeful termination in a way. And how do you understand that? How do you understand that emotionally when you look at that dynamic?
I do see a lot of surprising moments of hope in a very dark historical subject matter. And it could be a slightly overly, maybe at times optimistic narrative of resurgence and self-expression and political sovereign articulations. One could say that those three themes are pretty evident in the latter stages of this book, but those come perhaps at the expense of continued reservation underemployment, or various forms of social and even kind of housing or health care limitations. There are still very real challenges and pressing asymmetries of health and economics and politics that characterize much of Native America, particularly within reservation communities. So I'm trying to excavate kind of the hidden histories of activism and or intellectual formation or political organization that help explain those later themes, but I potentially do so at the limit of not sufficiently underscoring the deprivation, essentially, that is so common across much of this history. So maybe that's kind of the answer to it, is that I'm not wanting to get too drawn into a familiar story of victimization and or despondency, but trying to find kind of histories of strategic organization that yielded unanticipated and profound outcomes.
And you have a toddler, yes?
I do.
Yeah. And how do you want that child to understand this legacy as they growing up?
I'm not. I haven't really thought in those terms yet. But I
may not have time.
Right. My daughter is also a university student at the moment, and she's been studying some of these things, and I'm hopeful that all of our children will be given a kind of more kind of accurate historical portrait of America in their educational processes.
Yeah, and we hope that this book is going to be used in classrooms going forward, and we'll talk to you about marketing it for years to come. This is a book that will last. It will do beautifully as a new book, but it will last, I think, and it will make an impact. And if you had to give advice to the teachers who will be using this in the next few years, how would you have them present this material?
I would. Maybe it's my kind of hesitations as a scholar. I would kind of underscore that this is not the whole story, as we've already discussed, but this is one way into a larger story. I think it's a sufficient and kind of illuminating way. And I might encourage, as I do often when I work with teachers in various programs, I might encourage much more of a kind of rooted engagement with particular regional or local histories involving Native communities, particularly contemporary Native nations. So if one is teaching in Connecticut, the second chapter does kind of survey the history of British colonialism in the Native Northeast. It highlights kind of commonly understood kind of themes of historical development around the Puritan colonies of New England, including their kind of violent campaigns against resident Pequots. But I wouldn't think that would be sufficient coverage. So if one was teaching the subject in the region, one could perhaps use that early sections to help illuminate the formative moments of kind of settler-Indian relations, but then underscore it with subsequent more focused either Mohegan or Pequot or regional histories that explore really surprising themes of similar kind of surprisingly evident themes in these regional analyses. So, for example, the Mashantucket Pequot community has a beautiful museum that has a deep commitment to Pequot history that identifies how the tribe was essentially recognized by the state of Connecticut in the 1800s, and that state recognition, while lost in many accounts or in many political understandings of the region, became the basis for their subsequent federal recognition efforts in the 20th century. So it's a kind of remarkable history of endurance that illuminates the larger subject on a kind of local and regional and tribal level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate your being careful. It's a testimony to your scholarship that you don't overpromise here, but you do deliver the goods. I have to say, I just learned so much, and it was such a pleasure to read this wonderful critical survey and synthetic overview in a new light.
Well, I appreciate you and the press's continued support of this undertaking.
And you've had a lot of buzz from other historians and people working in the field, and including Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who gave you a great blurb. How do you hope the community will accept and celebrate the book?
Well, I've been kind of really appreciative of the reviews and recognitions that have kind of started to come in, and I'm particularly appreciative from those who have written works, and particularly synthetic works, that have these type of difficult challenges to them. And so, despite its limitations, I think there is a real urgency and need to have kind of interpretive comprehensions of various kinds. And so one of the themes of the second half of this book is the kind of legal doctrine of federal Indian affairs and the growing power of what is known as plenary power by the Congress over Indian affairs, which is not the original vision of the founders, but came in the aftermath of Reconstruction, when Congress started doing lots of stuff to remake American society. And so it does that as part of one of its efforts in a way that wouldn't satisfy, many perhaps lawyers or, some legal historians, but could reach into a kind of a broader, either undergraduate or even potential high school or kind of broader public understanding. So Dunbar-Ortiz, has written this type of interpretive overview in Indigenous people's history of the United States. She uses more of a kind of settler colonial paradigm than I do, but her response was really quite wonderful for me. And I really, someone like Colin Calloway at Dartmouth has written, so many books in my field. And so I think he really recognized also the need for this type of comprehensiveness. And a series of other scholars, like Brenda Child at the University of Minnesota, offered some really nice kind of responses. So I'm really kind of extremely pleased at the moment. I'm not quite sure what other kind of responses await, but I look forward
We'll
to
see.
seeing what they will be.
Exactly. You talked about the plenary power and the kind of activism that is currently at play, and fascinating to kind of see a kind of alternative power politic, organize itself.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that's the model going forward, or do you think how will the relationship change between Native Americans and Indians and the U.S. government?
It's a really interesting subject, because part of the reason so many U.S. historians have been unable to successfully recognize this field and incorporate it into the kind of canon of American historical formation is because its political dimensions don't conform to conventional stories of individual rights and or minority struggles for the expansion of those rights. So Native Americans are not, while mentioned in the Constitution 3 times, actually, if you include the 14th Amendment, while mentioned in the Constitution 3 times, Native Americans are not essentially fighting for, or have not historically been fighting for, the same rights as other Americans. The right to vote, free speech, freedom of press, or with the kind of conventional understandings of what constitutes American citizenry and or subjecthood. And so why we have been unable as a kind of field to bring Native American history sufficiently into the totality of American, particularly political, if not legal history, is because Native American political history sits outside of that normative understanding of citizenry, American subjecthood, and the struggle to obtain it. Mm-hmm. Which is kind of a struggle of freedom, as Eric Foner or many others would call it. Native American political history is not a study of unfreedom, even though the federal dominion over Indian affairs has been unjust, subordinating, perhaps exterminationist, according to some scholars. But the federal dominion over Indian affairs came out of, and as we were discussing, an initial form of bilateral recognition that treaties helped establish. Those bilateral recognitions kind of fell apart, in part because American citizens and leaders like Andrew Jackson didn't want to follow Supreme Court rulings like Worcester v. Georgia in 1832, which is in the book. And so if the federal government won't follow its own laws, these things don't resemble their intent. But over time, it has been Native Americans and their allies who have helped remind the federal government through legal advocacy, activism, political texts, and other kind of forms of advocacy. It's been Native Americans who've essentially not just reminded, but helped re-articulate, but have brought the federal government back into a domain of bilateral, not quite symmetrical, but bilateral. It's called the trust doctrine, but a bilateral form of political engagement that is at the heart of Native American sovereignty. And so while it's a long answer to your question.
It's fascinating.
But the reason plenary power, the doctrine of plenary power is so kind of threatening to Native American communities is that after Reconstruction, when Congress essentially stopped making treaties in 1871 and began passing laws that were unconstitutional, essentially, and the Native communities have spent much of the last century and a half almost trying to convince the federal government that it broke its own laws. And so the seizure of the Lakota Great Sioux Reservation after 1868, when the Treaty of Fort Laramie established this massive reservation in South Dakota with articles that gave tremendous recognition of Lakota authority both within and outside the reservation. Congress will pass an act in 1871 called the Lakota Act that begins, or I think it's 1877, begins dismantling that agreement, essentially. As Congress does, or as the state of Oklahoma's admission to the U.S. Union does, it is at odds with the treaty, the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867 that the Comanche have entered into. So these very large indigenous powers have made treaties with the federal government that federal government divisions, Congress or state leaders essentially are not fulfilling. Within those treaties are certain provisions that a certain number of Native peoples have to agree by voting to accept subsequent amendments of the treaty. So when those people don't vote, or some kind of shoddy elections are run, it becomes an illegal taking by the U.S. Constitution's by Supreme Court interpretations of the Constitution's authority in these areas. And so those illegal takings may not get essentially addressed or even determined until the late 20th century, when the federal government establishes something called the Indian Claims Commission. But they draw upon this kind of 19th century history of federal or congressional authority abuses, essentially. And so Indian communities are aware that their futures in many ways are potentially constrained by congressional potential actions that might undermine that kind of bilateral sovereign-to-sovereign relationship. And now, more recently, by kind of a U.S. Supreme Court that has largely been trained outside of the field of Indian affairs, other than Justice Gorsuch, by a Supreme Court that is not as supportive of these doctrines as its prior iterations. The Rehnquist Court and now the Roberts Court have been struggling to uphold certain doctrinal commitments that the Warren Court in particular had made in the Cold War era, when the doctrine of self-determination came into kind of full congressional statutory form, and numerous court rulings held that, in fact, treaty rights and membership criteria and sovereign authority essentially resided with the tribes, not other entities. So it's obviously a very complex subject, but it's always going to be an uncertain future for Native American communities given these kind of congressional powers. But since the 80s and thereafter, tribes have become really astute at navigating Congress and working often in under-recognized ways to get provisions into congressional bills, to have lobbying powers that people don't fully maybe recognize, and to try to win outside of a litigating court system that it can be also often very costly as well as uncertain.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the kind of answer that really kind of demonstrates the thoroughness of the book and the kind of philosophical understanding of what it is that makes a sovereignty have integrity and when it hurts itself, legitimacy.
And the second part of the book is called Struggles for Sovereignty. And the intention behind that was not just to highlight Native American struggles for sovereignty, but broader U.S. struggles for sovereignty. Mm-hmm. Because the sovereignty of the United States is not a predetermined given. It has been historically determined and developed and expanded, particularly through the rise of an administrative state in the aftermath of the Civil War that gave the federal government incredible new authorities and resources and delegated powers. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't take that development for granted. Mm-hmm. And we should kind of come to realize that Native American sovereignty sitting under the umbrella of federal sovereignty, both of those, if we can talk universally, Native American sovereignties and U.S. federal sovereignty are delicate undertakings that can potentially be misdirected or imperiled. And they have both informed one another. And so while it's really easy to see how the federal government has shaped Native American sovereign developments, it's less apparent how Native Americans have shaped federal sovereign developments. But that's part of the theme of the 19th century studies here, is to show how the rise of the federal government, particularly in the American West, was in many ways organized around or kind of emerged out of its Indian policy practices. Mm-hmm. Land acquisition through treaties, the establishment of forts and treaty agencies, the delegation of annuities through treaty, the creation of railroads often linking reservations. There's a whole infrastructure of governance essentially that the federal government initiates in Western North America in places that very few white settlers would see for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. So asserting that authority because of what they saw as a problem there.
Right.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful illumination on the integrity of sovereignty and how you hold American history accountable to it. That I think is one of the great attributes of the book.
Thank you.
So just you struggle to read it because it's so hypocritical and painful, and yet at the same time so important to understand. And I think with that, I want to thank you for writing it and giving us a chance to publish it. So.
Well, it's been my pleasure to work on it and to talk with you today.
Thank you.